So, just before we get to today's agenda that we had planned, we are interrupting with an additional bit of recording because since we pressed stop, Nicola Sturgeon has announced that she will not be standing again as an MSP in the 2026 Holyrood election. I suppose initial reaction, Geoff, we're probably not surprised by this, are we? We're kind of expecting her to stand down.
No, I think we all expected this was coming. You've had the top job for a number of years, and the idea that Nicola Sturgeon would sit on the back benches for another parliamentary term just never seemed plausible to me. So no surprises there.
Andy, the reaction to this has been mixed, I think. I think she does leave under something of a cloud when it comes to legacy. What's your take on that?
I think the reaction. It was always. I mean, the reaction has been telegraphed for months, years, from all the parties. The Nicola Sturgeon out of office is a pretty different figure in terms of public and political perception than the Nicola Sturgeon in office, and I think inevitably her departure was always going to be a pretty big event for the opposition parties to make something of. So, I mean, I think in terms of the reaction to it, I don't think there's been a huge amount of surprise. And as I say, as Geoff has already mentioned, this is in a sense news that isn't really news. It's always going to be big because of who she is, but nobody thought the outcome was going to be any different. It was just a question of when.
Yeah. In terms of reflection, Geoff, lots of people are using the phrase end of an era. Would you agree with that when considering her legacy?
Well, let's answer it a slightly different way. Look, you talk about legacy. There is a positive column and there is a negative column. In the positive column, you cannot take it away from her. Her outstanding electoral success really was unprecedented. The series of elections that she won, and I don't think that will be surpassed anytime soon. Secondly, as much as she has been kind of criticised over WhatsApp messaging and all the rest of it linked to COVID, I still think that was a big and positive moment for her overall. I think the way in which she communicated with the people, which ultimately she was communicator-in-chief with the electorate during a very uncertain time, as opposed to Boris Johnson. Well, I think personally, and I think many people would give her this, was actually to her credit. That's not to say the outcomes were particularly any better or different over the piece. And the negative column, though, this is when we get into the kind of policies, and she did say she wanted to be judged on reducing the attainment gap. That has been a failure by any real measure. She heralded the National Care Service as the biggest change in public service since devolution. That has not materialised. That policy is pretty much cancelled. And then, of course, there is the extremely toxic and divisive issue of gender recognition. I wonder if she had her time again, would she have played that a lot more differently in terms of recognising the toxicity of the debate and saying, look, I'm First Minister, I'm in charge. We're just going to take a pause on this or try and find a way in which we can seek compromise. That wasn't done. There was a doubling down, and I think we're still debating the remnants of that today and might be for some considerable time. There have been some policy successes. I think the child payment is completely transformational. Finally, I think the third column you would put in is the Constitution, and I have a degree of sympathy for Nicola Sturgeon in this respect, because frankly, she kept winning these massive elections, and the unionists were basically saying no, in the face of the democratic will of the people. They knew that the SNP were putting forward and advancing the case for independence, but we've all been there. We've all witnessed this. Almost on a yearly basis, we were told there was a referendum the next year. All became a bit old hat, and nobody, including many folk close to the SNP and in the SNP, actually believed it. And then finally, she took it to the Supreme Court, which turned out to be a major misstep. So all in all, her legacy will be mixed. Now, some politicians will take that actually when you've been at the top end of politics for a considerable time. But I think it's going to be a mixed legacy. Final point I would say is linked to my former boss. There's the association with Alex Salmond, the great friends turned political rivals. I know this might frustrate some of Nicola Sturgeon's followers, but the reality is that there would have been no Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister if it wasn't for Alex Salmond. Nicola was going to come third out of three people in the leadership contest in 2004 until Alec entered the race and went with a dual ticket proposal to Nicola. So the two are inextricably linked, despite the unfortunate circumstances of recent years.
Yeah, I mean, all really interesting reflections. I don't really disagree with any of them. I don't have too much trouble compartmentalising the sort of Nicola Sturgeon legacy. I always got on really well with Nicola Sturgeon on a personal level. She was always very kind to me. She was very kind to my family on one occasion as well. And I always found her an easy person to get along with. And I think she took a lot of abuse, actually, a lot of which was unwarranted. She dished it out a bit as well, to be fair. But she took a lot of flack, and I'm sure that would have been difficult to deal with. So on a personal level, I as I say, I always had a lot of time for her and still do. But legacies in politics aren't about personal stuff; they're about political stuff at the end of the day, and that's where I compartmentalise it, because I have to be honest and say that I'm not convinced the political legacy in the fullness of time will be looked upon really particularly well. I think when she took over from Salmond, it would be fair to say the economy turned far more into a more welfare orientated economy. We're going to talk about welfare during the podcast as well in relation to Labour, but I think that Nicola Sturgeon and those around her viewed welfare as success. I don't. I just can't get on board with that, right? And I think that she did, and I think that was one potential problem. Geoff mentioned COVID. I think that she did communicate very, very well during COVID, and she took a lot of plaudits for that. She also made decisions during COVID about lockdown and about school closures, which are generationally negatively impactful, and they were decisions that she didn't need to make. So let's look out for what the COVID legacy actually is. Yes, brilliant at communicating it, but the decisions that were taken, I'm extremely unconvinced. And broadly, and Geoff mentioned gender, and you cannot get away from the gender recognition issue as the central part of Nicola Sturgeon's legacy. There's no escaping it. It's there. It's not going away. And I think that is a key part of what she'll be remembered for.
Andy, I don't disagree with you on some of the decisions that were made during COVID, but I sometimes think it's very easy with hindsight. We look back and go, "Oh, that was completely the wrong decision." It was pretty unprecedented circumstances, and she had to take decisions in pretty record time in reaction to what was going on, and so. I think my point is more that when you got to the news at night and you had Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson both at the lectern talking about what was happening, I know who I was more reassured by. I'm not in any way absolving her of some of the decisions she took, because quite frankly there were mistakes there, but I just think there is mitigating circumstances in that respect.
Does this offer something of a relief or help for John Swinney and the SNP with a year to go now till the parliamentary election? Does this lift something of a cloud over the party or not, Geoff?
That's a really good question. And I actually suspect it's the former, Calum, because I think, as we're about to chat about, I think we'll talk about the potential for a reshuffle. John Swinney has to try and create a new brand SNP. There's going to be a lot of departures in this parliament, not just Nicola Sturgeon, a lot of others. And I think we are going to see a reshuffle that will see some new faces at the top team as they approach the next election. So I think, regardless of what people's views on your question are, it has to mark a change. It has to, by definition, because there's going to be so many personnel changes, and he has to take the opportunity and say this is a positive step forward to engender a new team with a vision for Scotland going forward.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, on the basis that this was going to happen at some point, politics dictates that it's much better for it to happen as early as possible. You don't want it happening a month before. The fact that it's happening a year before is good. Of course, it's not. Nicola Sturgeon's not out of the news, though. Nicola Sturgeon will be making headlines over the next year for a whole variety of reasons. So I'm not sure that the Scottish Government can look at this as being the sort of, closing of a book here. I don't think it is. It's one part of the story is that she's no longer going to be an MSP, but I don't think it takes Nicola Sturgeon out of the news here. So in the fullness of time, I think it's relatively neutral, really.
Yeah, fair enough. Right, thank you both very much for jumping in to do that. Now, let's go on with the rest of the podcast as planned.